Hi, I'm Dr. Dyan Haspel-Johnson, and it is time for a weekly sleep tip. So in the coming weeks, I want to talk about something that I think is really important, which is the concept of grief. And not just the concept of grief, but how it affects sleep and the ability to rest. So I'm going to talk about this for the next coming weeks because I think it's really important, and there's not a lot really out there about grief and how to process it, especially with regards to sleep and sleeping well and sleeping in the middle of having the experience of grief. So one thing that I think is important is to recognize that the feelings of grief are a transitional state. You know, I often talk about how issues with sleep are issues of transition. You know, we're okay with being awake, and then being asleep is another state. But insomnia is actually the issue with the connection between the two. So when we have trouble going to sleep, or we wake up and we're fatigued, so we have trouble getting up in the mornings, and we have this kind of hangover feeling, that's actually an issue of transition. The awakeness is one thing, the asleepness is another thing, but it's about how we get there and how we come out of that. So that is why I think it's so important to take the time to rest. And that's why I also think it's so important to do something like self-hypnosis, which is distinct from meditation actually, but hypnosis is a bridge state. It's about being somewhere between the conscious mind, awakeness, and the unconscious mind, asleepness, and it connects the two. It's actually a theta brainwave, so it's something that happens in some of the slower waves of sleep. So it's connecting, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's so effective for helping people to sleep and to be more present and awake in their lives. But when we have the experience of grief, I actually also think of grief emotionally as a transitional state. So a lot of times when we have lost someone or something that we love or that we've dreamed of, there is this grieving process, and it's about neither being in the one place of being together with that person, animal, job, place, whatever it is, hope, dream, and being in another, which is that you haven't quite landed, you haven't quite found your feet again and adjusted to it. And what I have experienced when I have experienced grief and loss in particular is, while on the one hand I want to feel better, of course, I want to feel like I've gotten through it. On the other hand, there's a part of me that doesn't want that. And I'm not saying that I want to be unhappy or that people want to be unhappy, but this state of grief and this difficulty in letting go, I think is partly because it holds us closer to the hope, dream, existence of that thing that we have now lost. So when we let go of our grief and our sadness and are on the other side of that, I think there's sometimes a fear that we're letting go of that thing, that person, that animal, that experience, and we don't want to let go of that because it felt so good to have it. So I think, first of all, that's an important thing to understand. And second of all, I think it's important to respect that in ourselves, that we have a right to our feelings. We have a right to our grief. And there's a tendency in ourselves, but particularly from people who love us or from people who we interact with who have trouble sitting and watching us suffer and don't want us to suffer, or we don't want to suffer, to say, feel better. What can I do to make it better? It'll be okay. You'll get over it, that kind of thing. And I think there's nothing like being told you'll get over someone or something that you love. There's nothing like being told that makes you feel more alone, I think. That's what I've felt in myself, and that's what I've noticed when I've worked with clients who, or have friends or family or people who are dealing with grief. So I think that taking this back to the concept of rest, it's very helpful actually to allow ourselves to rest in that grieving state. And that doesn't mean getting swallowed up by it or being self-indulgent about it, but it does mean being curious about it and allowing ourselves this space. I remember one time I suffered a great loss, and I had a really, really dear friend say to me, you need to get over it, you need to feel better, and because I had shared with her that I was having a really hard time on this particular day. And I said, I've already lost this loved one, and this is my grief, and I've already lost enough, so nobody's going to take this grief from me. It was like an important moment. I just sort of said it, but it was profound for me to have that experience of saying, this is mine, and I'm going to sit in it. And again, I wasn't trying to be self-indulgent about it. I certainly didn't want to sit in misery, but I had a realization in that moment that this was part of my process, and I needed to rest in that, and I needed to allow myself a safe space to rest in my feelings, and that only by doing that, by naming them, by being in it, by being present in it, and recognizing what it meant to me, could I then actually move out of it. So what I did in that moment was to orient myself, not just to the sadness of it, but to the love, to the fact that what it represented to me was love and connection to this person, and how important that was to me, and how much that person and that relationship had meant to my life. And so when I oriented to that, I was actually orienting to the resource of it, to the wonderful part about that relationship, about that being. And so as soon as I did that, it was no longer just about sadness. My grief wasn't just about sadness. It wasn't just about feeling sorry for myself or being miserable at all. It was about love, actually. It was about attachment. It was about valuing what that experience had been. And when I did that, even though that was bittersweet, it helped me to organize things and work them through. And so a lot of times I think it can be helpful to have a therapist or a really good friend or a loved one help you to process it if they're available to do that. But otherwise, just I think at least allowing yourself to orient in both ways, to the sadness, but also to the joy. And sometimes that's a little hard to do, but when we can rest in that, I think we can then sleep better at night, at least having that acknowledged. And again, if you have trouble and you're feeling like you can't pull out of grief, then please do seek help. There are help hotlines, and there are a lot of resources in the community for, there's even organizations that help find a friend if you're not interested in doing therapy, or organizations that offer support groups, especially online. You can find some of that now, and or find someone to talk to if that would help you. All right, I hope this is helpful. In the coming weeks, I'm going to talk more about grief, and actually more pointedly about grief and sleep, and even what happens in our dream life some of the time when we're grieving. So I hope this is helpful, and I wish you well.